Hi again. Thank you again for joining us for this extended clip and preview of the Riot Report, our upcoming PBS film, which will air in total, in full, on May 21st on PBS stations nationwide. It is my privilege and honor to introduce you to our panelists for this evening. On the end, Michelle Ferrari has been creating innovative, critically acclaimed documentary narratives for more than 2 decades. Her work as a screenwriter and story editor has been seen on PBS, HBO, and film festivals nationwide, and she has gathered honors from the Writers Guild of America, the Sundance Film Festival, and Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. Michelle is the director, co-producer, co-writer of this film. Next to Michelle is Elizabeth Hinton. She is an associate professor of history and African American studies at Yale University. She's author of From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, which received numerous awards and recognitions, including the Ralph Waldo Emerson Award from the Phi Beta Kappa Society. And next to me is Jelani Cobb. Jelani joined the Journalism School faculty of Columbia University in 2016 and became dean in 2022. He has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2015. He has received a Peabody Award for his 2020 PBS Frontline film, Whose Vote Counts, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary in 2018. Jelani is a co-producer and co-writer of the film that you just saw a preview of tonight. So I'm actually going to begin with both Michelle and Jelani. We first talked about the idea of this film. By now, it's probably 2 years ago?
2021.
Yeah.
It was 3 years ago.
Okay. And what I still find interesting, even though we've made it all the way through the production of the film, is that each of you came to me independently wanting to make this film. Before you met each other, you each were like, we need to do a film on the Kerner Commission and the Riot Report. So can each of you share, maybe starting with Jelani, since you're directly next to me, why you thought we should talk about this commission that is 40 plus years old at this time?
So I want to say, first, thank you to Blacksonian for hosting us. This is really kind of a milestone to be able to discuss the film in this venue. Also, thank you to Cameo for her support for this project from the beginning. And also, I'd seen Michelle's work previously, and so it was amazing, to be able to, even get in the room with her to start talking about this project. And Liz's work, which I knew through historical circles before, and so it was really kind of just great to bring all of these thoughtful, smart, creative people together in the course of this project. This is connected to another project, which is that I'd done a distilled version of the Kerner Commission report in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death. And we were looking around at American cities, and we were seeing people ask the same questions that the Kerner Commission had been grappling with a half century earlier. And so we, I say we, myself and one of my former graduate students just started culling down that 600-page report into something that would be distilled enough that people could grab the things that were most pertinent, in that moment where, like the title of Liz's book, America was on fire. And when that came out, I really felt like we had done that book as like a service. It was like, okay, we'll put this out. If somebody's interested, they may find it. And I was shocked at how much response it got. That it wasn't just a book that people were using, for maybe an African American history course. That we got This Other Life, and people were inviting us to come on podcasts and talk about it. And that was when I started thinking that maybe there was an appetite for a more full examination of what the Kerner Commission had actually been and what it had done.
And Michelle?
I second the thanks across the board. I read a book in 2018 by Stephen Gillen on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Kerner Commission's report, called Separate and Unequal. And at the time, my husband, who is Black, was performing a one-person show all over the country, and that show is about his experience growing up Black and about racism. And we were having these conversations every night at the dinner table that very much mirrored what was in the book that I was reading, the conversations that the Kerner Commission was having, although it was 50 years later. The book went on a list. Documentary filmmakers keep lists. It went on a list. I was working on something else. And then the pandemic happened and starkly revealed the inequalities that persist in our society. And then George Floyd happened. And I was invited to pitch something to American Experience. And in researching that pitch, came across notice that Jelani was publishing a book, and it was going to be coming out in July. And then right around the time that we started talking about it, there arose this sort of voluble controversy over CRT and the teaching of American history. And it really just did seem to me, and I think to all of us, that the Kerner Commission had something to say to the present.
Can I add one other person? There's another person who's connected to this production who's here. I don't know where he is.
Is he here?
My nephew, Nehemiah Bester, who texted me. Oh, he's there in the back.
Hi, Nehemiah.
Yeah. So he worked on the production too. It wasn't nepotism. He earned his spot, but
True. I can vouch for that.
he was happy. I'm happy to see him here too.
Thank you. Elizabeth, you also have been immersed in this topic, in this work throughout your career. Does it surprise you in any way, the persistence of this conversation, the persistence, the relevance of these issues? Like, has there ever been a point where you're like, when are we going to stop talking about this and do something?
So that's a great question. Thank you, Cameo. And I want to just thank the three of you for this powerful film. I am so honored to be a part of it in a very small way, and thank all of you for coming and joining this conversation and watching. That was only 1 hour of it. There's a lot more, so I do hope that you will tune in and share it with others when it premieres on the 21st. You know, in doing this work as a scholar of mass criminalization and American inequality, I'm always surprised, but I'm always not surprised. I think it's, that every time somebody is murdered by police, every time our liberal institutions betray us, which is something that we're very much struggling with in real time right now, it fits the historical pattern, but it's always devastating and surprising. I think for me, over the course of the time that I have been deeply engaged with the Kerner Commission's work as a graduate student working on my PhD, and then my first book, and then to my book, America on Fire, which is about Black rebellion. I call it Black rebellion, not rioting. That's a different conversation that we can have or not here. But that looks at Black rebellion itself as a response to the militarization and expansion of police during this period as part of the war on crime. My opinion of the Kerner Commission really changed. In my first book, I was very critical of the commission for its pathologizing of Black people, and you see that language through the report, and you cringe. and also for the way that ultimately, unfortunately, its recommendations on policing are the only things that end up actually getting implemented. So in some ways, this was not intended, but it ends up justifying the further expansion, militarization, and modernization of American law enforcement that leads to the mass incarceration we got in today. I began to really rethink the Kerner Commission's report in surprising ways after George Floyd, when it became just so freshly relevant. And when I was asked again and again to speak about, you know, what was happening and what could be done, I found myself naturally returning to the report and its recommendations and feeling like we know and we have known exactly what we need to do. And, you know, we don't need another commission. We need to follow the wisdom of this brilliant report. So I think my own thinking and kind of changing opinion on the commission itself has been maybe one of the things that's been most surprising to me, and you know, that's changed very much with time and with my own just deeper knowledge of these issues.
So I'm going to follow up on that on 1 second, but I just want to remind the audience that we are taking questions for the panelists as well. I think, are there cards at there at the side near the entrance? If you have a question, please put it on one of those cards, and those cards will come up to us so we can answer. So don't be shy if you have a question. Sorry? Unfortunately, we can't, but that's why we have the cards. So please, we are very happy to take questions, but for this evening, we're asking for them to go on the cards. But please, don't be shy. So,
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
Which is like a particular point of pride. You know, I grew up in Black communities, so I'm very much familiar with like people talking back to the movie. But it's like a particular point of pride when people are talking back to your movie.
Right.
So we have done something important now.
It's true.
Call and response. When it generates call and response.
Yeah, so use the cards for the second half of the call and response. We do want to hear from you. But Elizabeth, you said something interesting, and I think that we each felt this at different points in time. At first, the commission, it is cringeworthy. Like there are a lot of parts of it where you're just like, oh my gosh, look at these middle-class people who are like, we're gonna call witnesses and we're gonna go out to these communities and we're gonna figure out what's happening in these Black neighborhoods. Like, what are the grievances of these Black people? And it feels bizarre. And you know, there are parts in the film, and again, reminding you haven't seen the full film, but it almost feels like when we have those shots at the beginning of this clip with the white correspondents going out, and you characterize them as almost being like foreign correspondents because they're parachuting into these communities that they know nothing about. But it is really interesting that the commission takes this work so seriously. They are so earnest, like they truly want to honor their appointments on these commissions. So I'm wondering if, first Michelle and Jelani, for anyone, if you can just talk about how the commissioners approach this work. One of the commissioners who you spoke to in the film, who you saw, is Fred Harris, the last living commissioner. And it was so important to have him. But can you talk about the commission in general, but then also perhaps Fred Harris and how he remembers it?
Sure. I mean, those field visits that they did were extremely important in terms of achieving a unanimous result. The commission's report was signed unanimously by all of the commissioners. There were still unresolved arguments among them, but it was those field visits to the cities that had experienced violence that kind of turned the more conservative members of the commission around. It is kind of cringeworthy on one level, but on another level, what is there to do but talk and find out what's actually happening? And I would challenge you to imagine it happening today.
A commission like that?
Yeah. people actually going out and speaking to the people who are rioting, having a rebellion, uprising, whatever you want to call it.
And heads of corporations at that.
I think the thing that that I love about this, and Michelle and I talked about this, a number of times, where if you've seen the film 12 Angry Men, about how people start in one place and they wind up in a very different place. And what I respect about this commission is that they said it. It would have been much easier for them to not say it. They were going against the president who had appointed them. They were going against certainly their own kind of social circles and their upbringings and all those things. But they had these experiences. They went to these cities. They talked to these people. They heard what was happening, and then they said it. And when H. Rap Brown, who was none of the things that these commissioners were, he said they said the same thing that I've been saying all along. And so I
got put in jail for saying these things.
But I got put in jail for saying these things. And I really respected the fact that they had actually told the truth when all of the incentives were on the other side. One other thing about Fred Harris, which is very funny. First off, Fred Harris is 93?
94 now.
94? Yeah, Fred Harris is 94. So when we were working on this project, we had about a 6-month window before we could even start. I was in the middle of a project, Michelle was in the middle of a project. It was, we can't start this until like 6 months down the line. But Fred Harris is 91. We need to do that interview right now. And so we put all the other projects on hold, flew out to New Mexico, to Albuquerque, where he lives, spent a weekend, interviewed him and so on. Fred Harris is still around. I heard from him not that long ago, and he's doing his thing, and he has a perfect recall. And also, I'm not sure if you kind of get this, he has that charismatic quality that gets people elected to office. Like, Fred could run for something right now and people would vote for him. Like, he has that same sort of, still has that personal magnetism about him.
And I would just add, you said, Jelani, that they said it, and it would have been easier for them not to say it. And one of the parts of the film that you didn't see, but I hope you will tune in to watch, is Fred Harris talking about why it was so important that they use the phrase white racism. And he has several reasons that he gives, but one of them is that it was important to him in particular that the commission say to young Black people, "You're not crazy."
Just to add briefly on that point about truth, I think one of the things that really came through for me, even just watching it in this viewing that I hadn't quite put together before, is that when I.W. Abel, the CEO of an industry, said that he moved 90 degrees to the left, I think it's also a testament to when you actually look at the history of this country, talk to people, and study the problems, the Kerner Commission's recommendations, the need for a massive structural transformation, the need to finally address the root causes and the historical injustices of poverty, racism, discrimination, are very clear. So it's also just a testament to that this is the answer, and it's precisely why, we're also simultaneously seeing an attack on our ability to be able to tell these truths and to reckon and confront our history.
Absolutely.
I know that we saw it a little bit in this clip, but can you talk just a little bit to underscore what some of the recommendations of the commission were? Because I think what strikes me every time I see a clip, every time we have a screening, the fact that we're seeing recommendations back then in the 60s that we've talked about in the last 2-3 election cycles. And I want to underscore that point a little bit. Like, again, like one of the first things that always amazes me, guaranteed basic income. Like, I remember when Bernie said that and people were like, what? Like, is this guy serious? We can't do something like that. And honestly, naively, I thought it was the first time that anyone had proposed such a thing. So can you just maybe just tick off a couple of the recommendations that were made?
Do we all want to do one? We can all do one.
Okay.
Liz, I think Liz should go first.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things, and again, when you study these problems, the real kind of root problem is jobs and unemployment. So the Kerner, and which is related to the guaranteed basic income. So the Kerner Commission recommended the creation of 2 million jobs for disadvantaged people, that was the terminology they used, by mobilizing the public and private sector. 2 million jobs in a 5-year span, 1 million jobs within the immediately. That was one of the, I won't take them all, but I think that was one of the central ones.
Shall I take the media?
Oh, sure, that'd be great.
They also recommended, they came to the conclusion that the coverage being entirely through white eyes was very problematic. And they recommended that news facilities in particular diversify, which actually they did do slowly, but you did see a greater attention to telling stories from the Black community from a Black perspective. And that was actually one of the small successes of the Commission's report.
One of the most interesting things about the Commission was its understanding of policing. It would have been easy for them to say, because Newark, Watts, so many of these situations exploded in response to police behavior, the problem is with policing. And they took an extra step and said that the policing is an ignition point that really reflects all of these other kinds of social and institutional failures. But on policing, they made an observation, which is almost kind of forgotten among the very many things that they said. One of the points that they raise is that people in the ghetto, as they would have, the term that they used at the time, just had too much contact with the police. Every problem, involved a police officer, even things that weren't related to law enforcement, and that there needed to be other kinds of social remedies. There needed to be other institutions that could address the day-to-day needs of these communities aside from just policing. Half a century later, we heard people making those same arguments, except they were saying defund the police. It was the same logic. It was the same principle of saying, and even then, one of the interesting things is that some of the most common proponents of that idea were police themselves. They're saying, oh, they have us doing all sorts of things that we're not trained for, and then everyone gets upset when we do it wrong, and blah, 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 blah. And it was an idea that they promoted in the report that just kind of disappeared from our discourse for decades and then popped back up again.
So I'm going to throw in some of the questions from the audience. First question, do you believe another president will commission a similar report in the present? Could that happen now? Could this commission happen now?
I think it could, but I think, as I think it was Fred Harris, you'll correct me, said in the video, if that happens, because we already know what we need. We know what we need. We need massive investments in communities that have been denied resources for generations, for centuries, and we know where those places are, and we know the scale of investment that we need. So we don't need another commission. Another commission is continuing to kick the can, and we have to stop kicking the can. What's required if we want to address these issues is a major structural transformation and reinvestment, and we know that. So we have better data now. We would need maybe updated data to a certain extent, but we don't need another commission. We just actually need to build the political will to create a more equitable and robust democracy in this country.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, Jelani, that you say in the film, I don't think it was in this clip, I'm losing track, but you make this really interesting point about just presidential commissions in general, like what they're typically used for, but then also how many times these kinds of issues have been raised in a presidential commission. Can you just talk about that for a second?
I mean, there are all of these commissions. I mean, and even not just even on the presidential level. Like, if we were thinking, after 65, there's a commission on Watts. After 67, there's a commission on Newark. The commission on Newark, their findings, I went to the library in Newark once and said I wanted to see the report on the 67 uprisings, and they came back with, those carts that they have in the library. The whole thing was full. It's like 8 or 10 volumes, and each volume is like this big. And so there was the commission that they did in Newark. Baltimore had a commission after 1968 when King died and the city went up in flames. There was a commission, if we kind of moved up after the Rodney King uprisings in 1992. I'm leaving commissions out now. There was a commission after the uprisings in Miami in 1980, after the Arthur McDuffie killing by the police. There was the Ferguson Commission, the 21st Century Task Force on Policing that Obama did, and I'm leaving some out. Suffice it to say that we have enough, we could repopulate a forest with all the paper that we have used, to create commissions and reports, which, with varying degrees of specificity, point in the general same direction. Kerner is the most exhaustive of them. But most of those reports, when you go through, they have the same sort of DNA and making these same sorts of arguments.
Another question from the audience. This one's a little close to home. What are your thoughts on the current protests happening at universities across the country?
Are there protests happening at universities? I'm the dean of the journalism school at Columbia. I believe in the First Amendment. That's what I'll say.
Liz, do you want to answer that? Add to that, or you want it?
I'll leave that there.
Okay, fair. The one thing that I will say is that again, we've had a number of screenings, and it is very interesting that some of the language that was used in the 60s is similar to language that's been used now. Some of the ways that the protesters have been characterized is very reminiscent of what was happening in this film.
Can I say something on that point?
Sure.
I think, well, a couple of things. I mean, what we've seen in over the past month, few weeks, to your first question, Cameo, it's not surprising at all, but it's always surprising when you see police be deployed in this way, and I think it's another example of the turn that solidified during this period where police would be the kind of managers of any kind of dissent, social unrest, it's a criminalized response rather than trying to do what might be the more humane thing. And I think, even actually watching the second night or the second time that police came to Columbia to break up what was going on in the occupation of Hamilton Hall, watching the news on real time and hearing before the police went in, people talking about outside agitators, people talking about, well, we have intelligence that there's anarchists in there, to explain why they had, dressed all of the officers in full riot gear, brought this big tank-looking thing to actually get into the building, and it was, justified because there might be outside agitators, which you see again and again and again in terms of how people, and this is, the film explores this, but we didn't see that part of it, but, to think about, to justify the continued escalation of police force in these communities during the uprisings. So yeah, I mean, we see these tropes again and again, and I think the other thing is that, you know, for a lot of college students, especially white college students, when they're protesting is when they get treated like Black people, and especially poor Black and brown people, get treated on a everyday basis.
Oh, yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that. One thing that I want to bring up, you mentioned it. Our film is called The Riot Report. That is a phrase taken from the report in the way that it was published, the way that it was characterized. Riot is a very contentious and controversial word. Can you talk about, like, it was a very intentional choice for us to call it this, but this is not a word that we use anymore, just in regular conversation. So Elizabeth, and then anyone else who wants to talk about it, can you just talk about the word riot versus uprising versus rebellion?
So you heard President Johnson saying that this violence, you know, this is the same thing as the Klan. You know, the administration just said this is criminal, this is juvenile delinquency, you know, and completely dismissed the fact that, as the Kerner Commission pointed out, right, the cause of this political violence, the demands that people were making when they threw a Molotov cocktail or threw a stone or a rock at a police officer were the same demands as the mainstream civil rights movement. These were political, especially the extent of the rebellion. Even after the Kerner Report was policed, in my book, America on Fire, I talk about that actually, you know, the peak moment was between June 68, after Martin Luther King Jr. gets assassinated, and the first major federal crime control legislation is passed in 1972, when there's nearly 1,000 rebellions in smaller cities that, you know, that are being fought against and with police, who now have, due to the Law Enforcement Assistance Act and the hundreds of millions of dollars the federal government is pumping into local police forces, all of this riot control equipment at their disposal. In labeling this political violence as criminal and as rioting, it ends up producing this cycle where then the only response to it is more police, which is, of course, the very thing, the very kind of like jumping off mechanism that is causing the political violence in the first place. So when we use riot to describe it and we criminalize this political violence, we prevent ourselves from our very language, from being able to think about the kind of necessary response to prevent it in the long term that the Kerner Commission points us towards.
As a filmmaker, though, using archival footage from the period where everyone constantly refers to them as riots, and then talking to Fred Harris and other people who worked on the commission as staffers, to ask them to remove that word from their vocabulary was to make them very self-conscious and very difficult for them to tell a story. So we elected to have John Powell take on the word and explain why it's problematic, because otherwise there was no way to talk about it.
I see this slightly differently, which is that in the context of Black life, riot is lawless, apolitical lawlessness. But in the context of lots of other circumstances involving white people, it's clearly understood as political. So this country owes its origins to a series of riots. When you go back, you see even historians now use the word riot in reference to the bread riots ahead of the American Revolution, or the draft riots, which happened in the midst of the Civil War and make Lincoln realize that he has to push for emancipation. Like, all of these contexts in which like white people behave in this way is granted a kind of political authority. And so that makes me want to use the word riot more and say it's explicitly political. And so it's like basically kind of how do you grapple with the nuances of language which is being used against you. But I always kind of felt that way, like if we do it in Detroit in 1967, it's lawlessness. If you do it in Boston, you know, because you have a dispute over tea taxes, then it's political.
Another question from the audience. Michelle, can you talk about any aspects that you uncovered in the researching of this film, Michelle Angelani, that just you couldn't fit in?
Well, there's so much that we couldn't fit in. I would say the most interesting piece of the story that we just couldn't make a place for has to do with the younger people, the teams who went out to the cities. They were, on the whole, a generation younger than the commissioners, and many of them had been to the Peace Corps, and they were much more radical than the commissioners. And the social scientists who did the analysis were responsible for writing an interim report, you know, expressing what they believed to be the reasons for the uprisings. And they actually would call them uprisings. And that report was entitled The Harvest of American Racism. And it was said to have so enraged the executive director of the commission that he screamed for the first time in the entire year that they were working together. And it was buried. It does exist in the LBJ archive, but it was never seen by any of the commissioners. That being said, the idea that white racism should be the theme of the commissioner's report really did come from that book. And David Ginsburg, the executive director, brought it forward to the commissioners, and it ultimately met with unanimous approval.
What was amazing was, you know, that Harvest of Racism document wound up being published, but it was like 20 years later. Like, they buried it, you know? And so, as much as the Kerner Commission, as like I said, would commend them for saying the thing that they saw, even they couldn't say everything. Like, they would, oh, no, that's too much. But it also was a testament to the clarity of the people working in those younger groups, too.
So I'm getting the sign to wrap up, but I would love for each of you just to share a closing thought, or what it could be what you want people to take away from this film, or it could be an emotional response to how you feel about seeing it in the Oprah Winfrey Theater at the Blacksonian, as you said. But just, I'll start with Michelle and come down the line. Just closing thought.
Okay. I am going to echo what Jelani said at the beginning, which is that it's kind of a dream to be showing even excerpts of the film here. And I really do thank you all for coming out tonight on this sort of dismal, cold spring evening. And I really do hope that you will watch the full film. I mean, I think, you know, you come and you see these excerpts, and it's quite a lot of the film, and in a way you feel like you've seen it, but it really is a different thing when you watch the whole thing. So I hope that you will do that, and thanks again so much for coming.
I also want to echo the thanks for coming, and I hope that you can continue some of this dialogue in your own communities and engage with the report, engage with the film. It really offers a vision for what the United States could and should be that I think is in some ways maybe perhaps more relevant today than ever. I will also say that the Eisenhower Foundation is publishing this summer an edited volume with new work reflecting on the Kerner Commission, and a new edition of the Kerner Commission report that they also hope will help us think about how to engage with what is going on in this country right now and the crossroads that we face.
I want to go in a slightly different direction, which is to say that in 1994, when I finished Howard, I got my first job, you know, after I finished, it's a history major, history English, basically double major at Howard. And the first job that I got was at the Anacostia Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian. And so from the very beginning, as I was just trying to figure out who I was, what I wanted to do in the world, what, if anything, I had to say, the Smithsonian has been integral to me figuring out how to, move through my life and my profession, my career. And so it really means a lot to be back here at this point as well. So I really just want to humbly say thank you.
So again, thank you to all of you for joining us tonight for this special preview of the Riot Report. Again, we hope that you watch the film in full on May 21st, beginning on May 21st, 9 p.m., PBS stations nationwide, but then also available to stream on our website. A huge thank you to the Smithsonian, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And again, just thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to Michelle Ferrari. Thank you to Elizabeth Hinton. Thank you to Jelani Cobb. Have a great night.